Hey everyone, welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. I'm Adam, and the focus of our lecture today is on the cognitive neuroscience of language. In the last lecture, we focused on the cognitive neuroscience of syntactic processing. So today, we will focus on the cognitive neuroscience of semantic processing. So this is actually part 2 of our lectures on the cognitive neuroscience of language. So make sure that you watch the first lecture also on the cognitive neuroscience of syntactic processing, which was the previous lecture. So one of the articles that we read for today was by Pulvermuller, published in 2005. The title is Brain Mechanisms Linking Language and Action. And this article was published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience. This is a nice article for us to consider as we reflect on the nature of the mind. One of the major questions that we had been thinking about throughout the course is whether cognitive modules, for example, the language processing module, if that is localized in a specific area of the brain, or if it's more distributed in sort of like a network configuration. Okay, so that was sort of one of the questions that we had. Does language reside right here, or is it more distributed in a network style? Okay, in this article, we'll see that Pulvermuller is going to lean towards a network approach rather than a localized module approach. Okay, so in other words, the cortical systems for language and action control were traditionally thought to be paradigm examples of independent and autonomous functional systems or modules, right? You might think that you have a language module, right? Like universal grammar. You might think that you have an action control module, and you have a vision module, and so on, right? Like modules for each sort of important activity, right? And we had discussed the nature of modules and what they are thought to entail when we discussed Jerry Fodor, right? And some of the requirements for modularity, right? Pulvermuller is going to suggest that cortical functions might be served by distributed but interactive functional systems rather than local encapsulated modules. Okay. Pulvermuller suggests that cortical systems for language and action develop specific links between each other whenever actions correlate with specific language processes. And we'll get a nice understanding of this as we look through the article for today, and we see how action words involve similar neural mechanisms as action processing, like when we observe the actions of others, which I think is really cool. So there's several different types of studies that suggest the role of the motor cortex in language processing. A previous fMRI research, functional magnetic resonance imaging research, has shown that the observation of action-related pictures activates the premotor cortex in a somatotopic fashion. And in the next slide, I'll show you what we mean by somatotopic organization. Okay. Previous fMRI research has also shown that mental imagery of actions activates the premotor cortex in a somatotopic fashion, right? So these two bullets point out that both the observation of action pictures as well as mental imagery of actions, right? Observation as well as imagination, both of these processes activate premotor cortex, which is really amazing, right? And also the next step of our amazing journey is it doesn't just activate the premotor cortex in like a general way, but rather it activates premotor cortex in a somatotopic manner. Okay, so what that means is when I see I love combat sports or martial arts. So when I see someone punch, right? Or when I read the word punch, or when I mentally imagine, recreate the action of punching, I am engaging not just the premotor cortex, but relevant areas of the premotor cortex, in particular, those relevant for hand actions, okay? And I think that this is really awesome. A cortical homunculus, you may have got a glimpse of this picture on the next slide, right? That's a homunculus, a little man. This cortical homunculus is often used to illustrate how a representation of the body resides within the brain, okay? We don't have a little guy in our brain, but the representation of our body is represented in our brain in a somatotopic manner, okay? There's sort of a correspondence between the hand part, my hand, and then a part of my brain that processes hand activity. And we'll see in the next few slides that the amount of cortical tissue devoted to various body parts is not evenly distributed, but rather it's unevenly distributed towards those body parts which are most sensitive or important for us. Okay, so not so much devoted to like elbow, right? Or, you know, think of another part of your body that's you don't use very often, like the back part of your shoulder, right? So you're not going to have much representational space devoted to that. But think about, on the other hand, in contrast with the elbow, think about your lips, your tongue, your fingers, right? Dexterity, playing the piano, violin, sewing, all the awesome things that we do with our hands and our mouths, our articulators, right? This requires fine-grained motor control. And we're going to devote more neural circuitry or more real estate cognitively and neurally to processing that type of information. Okay, so we'll see that the somatotopic map, it's somewhat disfigured in that it doesn't look like a man or a human, but certain parts of the body are going to be emphasized. So more cortical tissue is devoted to some body parts than others, as reflected in the size of the parts in the drawings. And here we just see in the few figures that I've provided on this slide, this is a figure from our last lecture on the cognitive neuroscience of syntactic processing, and it's just highlighting for us all the Brodmann areas in the brain. Okay, it is really beautiful with all the colors in here. Also down here, we have a more realistic depiction, which also provides not just Brodmann areas, but names for these specific regions. And this is helpful just so that we can see, because today we're going to focus in particular on like the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. And we can see that here in this figure, right? This green strip right here, this is going to be primary motor cortex. Okay, and we see that that resides on the frontal lobe side. Okay, and then over here we have primary somatosensory cortex, right? And that's actually going to be in the parietal lobe side. Okay, and then we know we have the occipital lobe back here, right? BA17 for vision, and then we have auditory cortex here in the temporal lobe. Okay, but as we talk about linguistic processing, we're going to see that we're going to get some cool activation here in premotor and somatosensory areas. All right. So what I'm going to show in the next few slides, on this slide, we're going to look at the somatotopic map in primary somatosensory cortex. And then the next slide, we're going to look at the somatotopic map in primary motor cortex. Okay, and you'll see that the organization, the somatotopic map, is very similar in both somatosensory cortex and in motor cortex, except for there are going to be some slight adjustments, right? There's going to be, if you look really carefully at the homunculus, you'll notice that there's a slight difference between somatosensory and motor cortex. And this is just going to reflect that when we perform motor actions, we might need more neural circuitry or real estate devoted to those motor actions, whereas on the sensory side, it might require less. Okay, so I encourage you to compare these two and sort of think about it. And then I've also provided in the later slide, we can compare the motor area to the sensory area. Okay. All right, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We're starting off now looking at the somatosensory cortex. Okay, and we see that somatosensory cortex is going to be on this side. Okay. So we have primary somatosensory cortex on this side of the central sulcus. And this is highlighting for us. Remember that the central sulcus here is going to be separating the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe, right? So on this side of the central sulcus, we have that primary somatosensory cortex. And in terms of numbers, this is going to be BAs 3A, 3B, 1, and 2. And that's usually how we mention the areas in somatosensory cortex. But to make it easier for you to remember for pedagogical purposes, I've just put it in order, like numerical order, 1, 2, 3A, 3B. Okay, but as you read through the literature, you might notice that they often put 3A and 3B first. Okay, and don't worry about that too much right now. Okay, the important point is that we have somatosensory cortex, BAs 3, A and B, 1 and 2, right? And in this area, we have a nice somatotopic map. Okay, and we can see, working our way up from here down here, that this is the representation, the map of our body in our brain. Okay, so we have the toes, feet, leg, trunk, neck, head, shoulder, arm, hand, digits, thumb, neck, eyes, nose, face, lips, jaw, tongue, throat. Okay, working our way from the top and like slightly towards the medial side, like the middle part, and then working our way around, okay, and down. Okay, cool. And then just notice sort of the color coordination here, right? That this color maps onto this area of the body, this color maps onto this area, this color maps onto this area. Okay. All right, now in the next slide, we're going to go on to the other side of the central sulcus and take a look at primary motor cortex. There is also a somatotopic map in primary motor cortex. And primary motor cortex is BA4 in the frontal lobe. Okay, so this is just on the other side of the central sulcus. Okay, so we see here in this figure, this is primary motor cortex here. Okay, and then we have the premotor cortex here, lateral and medial. Okay, so lateral premotor cortex is towards the lateral side, right? And then the medial premotor cortex is more towards the midline or the middle part. Okay, and so we see that here, the green indicates medial premotor cortex, and this light blue indicates the lateral premotor cortex. Okay, and then this in a purplish color represents primary motor cortex. Okay, and this is a lateral view, right? So if you're looking from the outside, and this is a medial view. So if we crack open, if we split the brain in half, right? If we like remove the corpus callosum and we just look at the inside part, we can see that this is, right? This is the inside of that, and this is the inside of that. Okay, and we, just like we had a representation of the body in the brain in somatosensory cortex, same deal in motor cortex, right? We have this somatotopic map, and unsurprisingly, going from starting medially and working our way around laterally, right? We have toes, feet, leg, trunk, head, shoulders, arm, hand, digits, thumb, neck, eyes, nose, face, lips, jaw, tongue, and throat. Okay. All right, this is going to be important for us to understand as we discuss how language processing activates certain areas, right? Like when I read the word kick, and when I imagine kicking, and when I kick myself, right? When I plan to kick, we'll see that certain areas and networks are going to be selectively activated. And one more time, I think it's just nice to have a lot of beautiful images that highlight different aspects. And so what's great about these images is you can see here, we have a view of the brain, and then we have the motor area here and a sensory area here. Okay, and that's reflected here in this image. Okay, also, this is a useful image, this sort of lateral view, because it'll show us the trunk, arm, hand, face, and tongue areas in both somatosensory and motor cortex, right? So what I want you to think about, right, sort of just form a hypothesis before I tell you the results. When we read punch, like the word punch, when we read hand-related words, right? Or when I simulate, right, the action of punching in my mind, or when I prepare to actually throw a punch, or I'm actually throwing a punch, try to think about where in the brain we might get some selective activation, right? And we're talking about hand activity now. So we might see something perhaps in these areas, right? As opposed to, for example, these areas or these areas, right? That would be really cool if we saw that in the lecture today. So stay tuned and we'll see what the data shows. Okay, this figure is also nice because it ties together Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And we had been talking about in our lecture on syntactic processing, right, the relationship between sort of like auditory phonology, right, the processing of speech sounds, right, closer to temporal lobe in the primary auditory cortex. But then also when we're preparing to articulate, right, in a linear fashion, right, when we're taking our sentences that we want to produce and we arrange them in linear order for the purposes of articulation, we see that we get more selective activation over in these areas towards the front. Okay, so in any case, I think that looking over the figures for today and the last lecture, it'll be helpful in trying to piece together both the distributed nature of linguistic processing, right? There's speech sounds going on over here. There's plans for articulation over here, but not just that, there's different activity going on in different parts of the brain, but that it all works together in a network style fashion. Okay. All right. So in this article by Pulvermuller, the main idea is that if action words are semantically related to the movements of the face or articulators, right? So think of action words that are related to the face, right? Like chewing or smiling, right? If action words are semantically related to movements of the face, then distributed neural assemblies would include semantic neurons in parasylvian motor and premotor cortex for face-related words. Okay, and what we mean by that is we can see that here, right? We're talking about face activity, and look on this map here. Where do we get face, the face represented somatotopically? Not up here, but closer down here, right? We see face and tongue here, right? So when we look at our little model here, we see that this network area, and it's not just one dot, right? Or that would suggest a very localized area that processes face-related words. Rather, what we get here is more of like a distributed functional network, okay? And we see that this area, although it's not localized, there isn't just a face processing area of the brain localized to right here, but we see that there's a network that's responsible for processing face-related words, but it's still different. That network is still distinguishable, clearly distinguishable from the network that processes arm-related words. And both of those networks are distinguishable from the network that processes leg-related words, okay? I'm trying to highlight here that in order to capture areas of the brain that process leg, arm, and face-related words, we don't necessarily need three modules, distinct modules of the brain to capture that. We can also have, alternatively, three distinguishable networks of the brain, okay? And we're just importantly emphasizing the distinction between like single modular localized places versus distributed networks. Okay, and here we see that the processing of face-related words occurs in this parasylvian motor and premotor area. Okay, and we can see why it's called that by looking, let me look for a good picture for you. So in this figure, we see that in this figure, it's titled lateral fissure, but I believe in the previous lecture, I uploaded an image where it was also identified as the Sylvian fissure. And, you know, it's okay. The important thing is that the processing of face-related words like chew or smile, right? This is going to be closer towards this Sylvian fissure area. Right, so we see here closer to the lateral or Sylvian fissure is face areas of the homunculus or the somatotopic map, right? Rather than, for example, the leg or the foot. Okay, so that's how you can remember that the parasylvian motor and premotor cortex is activated or selectively engaged in the processing of face-related words. Okay, and that's pretty cool. Similarly, if action words are semantically related to the movements of the arm or hand, then distributed neural ensembles would include semantic neurons in lateral motor and premotor cortex for arm-related words. Okay, so we see here a little bit higher, right? Face-related words down here. Arm-related words, we're going up a little bit higher right here, okay? And we see here in our homunculus that the hand, right, arm-related activity is represented higher than face-related activity in the somatotopic maps in somatosensory and motor cortex, okay? So that's why we're gonna call selective activation for arm-related words. We'll call this, we'll say that this selectively activates the lateral motor and premotor cortex. Okay, and then finally, last but not least, if action words are semantically related to the movement of the leg or the foot, right? So for kicking, then distributed neural ensembles would include semantic neurons in dorsal motor and premotor cortex for leg-related words. Okay, and what we see is that the network responsible for processing leg-related words is located up here, okay, more dorsally, right? And the way that I like to remember, like, what do we mean by dorsally? Well, if you think about like a dolphin, right, its fin is gonna be on its back, right? Or its little, you know, the thing that sticks out of the water, right? So you can sort of, for some reason that helps me remember like dorsally, right? Something that's like up on the back. And when the dolphin's swimming or whatnot, you'll sort of see the fin popping out of its back, right? So, you know, you might think of the brain as sort of like a dolphin, right? It has a nice little curve, and these leg-related words are just hanging out up here where that fin would be, okay? Okay. So now we have the main idea, right? We have an idea of what is meant by the somatotopic representation of the body and the brain. And we can see how we're going to tie the processing, linguistic processing of certain word types, right? Face type words, arm type words, leg type words to those areas of the brain, to related networks of the brain. Okay. Functional links between the superior temporal speech perception system and the inferior frontal motor system are demonstrated by functional imaging studies that show the activation of frontal areas in response to speech input. Okay, so what we're saying here in this slide is that we know that the speech perception system and the motor system are related. I mean, they're linked together functionally. Okay, and the way that we know that is when we hear speech input, like when you start talking to me, it's not just going to activate the superior temporal speech perception system, right? It's not just activating primary auditory cortex, right? Of course it should, but what's really cool and novel is that it also activates inferior frontal areas of the brain, right? The motor system, okay? And you might think, why is it doing that, right? And we can think of just the nature of communication that there's going to be a development of a functional link between hearing and a preparation for motor speech output. Okay. Figure 1A shows data from magnetoencephalography, all right, MEG, demonstrating that superior temporal activation elicited by spoken words is immediately followed by inferior frontal activation. Okay, so activation here is immediately followed by activation here, 22 milliseconds later. Okay. So notice that 22 milliseconds is really quick, right? So it's not like we get processing in the speech perception system first, and then like minutes later, or, you know, much later, like as preparation, maybe like 3 minutes later, I'm going to talk, right? It's not like it has to wait that long to activate or start to elicit activation in frontal areas, right? It's happening immediately, right? And the question is, it's perhaps automatic, right? One question in this article was, is it automatic? Does this happen automatically? And notice the timing, right? It's 22 milliseconds. So it's happening very quickly. Figure 1B, right? So 1A was this figure here, and it's just showing you that first, what do we get? We get some activation here in the superior temporal speech perception system, right? And we should know by now that this is in the temporal area, right? And that's where primary auditory cortex is located. Excuse me. And then shortly thereafter, we're talking on the time, in the time span of milliseconds, we're then getting activation in frontal areas. So that's pretty cool that we get to see that, right? Cool. Figure 1B, so this figure over here on the right, shows fMRI data, right? Functional magnetic resonance imaging data for a participant demonstrating premotor activation while listening to speech. Okay, so again, while listening to speech, we're getting premotor activation. Okay, and that should tell you something about the predictive or functional nature of cognition, right? Cool. Let's continue. Here's another beautiful figure that shows fMRI data revealing that overlapping areas of activation are elicited by corresponding actions and action words. Okay, so we're going to see some overlap, right, between areas of the brain that are active during movement and then areas of the brain that are active during the reading of words. Okay, passive reading of action words. Okay, and notice that it's not going to be the exact same activation, right? It's not going to activate all of the areas, like when you read the word punch, it's not going to activate all the areas that are active when you punch, right? It's also not going to activate the same areas as strongly, okay? But what's important for our purposes is we're going to see relevant activation in similar areas, okay? And this is going to strongly suggest that there is some sort of reuse or re-recruitment of similar areas of the brain for hand type things, whether that's movement, imagination, or comprehension, right? Language comprehension and production, okay? In some sense, there's a schema, right, in the brain that's going to be reusable for types related to the feet, to the tongue, and to the fingers, okay? Because these are distinguished somatotopically in somatosensory and motor cortex. So we'll see that leg-related words activate areas overlapping and adjacent to areas involved in foot movements, right? So we see, what do we see here? For foot movements, when you kick, right? We saw that we're going to get activation here, right? And just so we're clear, that's here, right? The leg and the feet, right? Notice that it was sort of up here towards the middle, right? And again, from a different view, we see that that's here. And then in this figure, right, we're sort of looking down on the head, that's here, right? That where your leg is, leg information is being processed for movement, okay? And notice that some of that area, right? Some of that area for processing foot movements is also active during the reading of action words regarding the feet, okay? So look at that right here, boom, and then over here too, all right? And that's pretty cool. And the important thing is, right, when you kick, we know that there's activation here, neural activation here. And what's important is when we read the word kick, we don't get idiosyncratic activation, like activation way over here, or activation way down here, or activation in this area where tongue movements are processed, right? We're not getting random activation, right? But rather the brain, notice what's being recruited for foot movements. Well, guess what? Similar areas are going to be used for the processing of foot words, okay? So I think that that's really awesome. Some more awesome stuff is that arm-related words activate areas overlapping and adjacent to areas involved in finger movements. So we see that finger movements, right? When playing the piano or type in a paper, we see that we're going to get finger movements in this red area, right? And we can see that the red area is between the blue and the green area, right? Similarly, we see that arm-related words here are between the leg words and the face words in this model. And also on the maps here, the somatotopic maps, we see that the arm-related words, right, are represented in between the leg area and the face area, right? So as you remember and memorize these somatotopic maps, you should be able to start forming some solid predictions, right? Like, if I conduct a new study and I have someone listen to, for example, you know, hand-related words, trunk-related words, tongue-related words, right? You can predict where we're going to get selective activation. Okay, what I think is really cool. Okay, so we know that we're going to get activation here for finger movements, but also look over here. We get partial reactivation of those same areas when we read arm-related words. Okay, and a little bit over here too, right? So boxing, we're gonna, when we box, right? When I go to the gym and I practice my boxing, I'm going to get some cool activation in these areas. And then when I go home after I'm done and I read a book about boxing or combat sports, when I'm reading that punching section, I'm going to reactivate some of these same areas, partial reactivation. Okay. And again, notice that these areas that are activated when I'm reading arm-related words, right? They're not random. It's not like I'm getting activation here, here, or here, but selective reactivation of these areas involved in movement. And then finally, we see that in the processing of face-related words. All right, so now we're looking at green areas now. Face-related words activate areas overlapping and adjacent to areas involved in tongue movements. Okay, so when you move your tongue, when I move my tongue, I'm going to get some activation in these green areas. Okay, and we see that that's here by this parasylvian motor and premotor area. Okay, and that is also located down here, right, closest to the lateral fissure, all right, or the sylvian fissure. Okay. And not just when I'm chewing or articulating do I get activation here, but you know, I love to read about linguistics, so maybe I'm reading an article about articulation, right? I'm gonna, as I read about articulators and all the cool things they do, we will get some partial reactivation in similar areas. Okay. Awesome. This indicates that a common neural substrate is involved in the processing of actions and the meaning of action words. Okay, and that's why we're talking about this in the lecture in semantics, because we're thinking about word meaning in this lecture. All right, so we looked at some cool studies from fMRI, MEG, using some other methods to find functional links between areas of the brain responsible for movement and areas of the brain responsible for linguistic processing. In this next slide, we're going to look at a different methodology, transcranial magnetic stimulation. Okay. In one TMS study, different parts of the motor system were stimulated with weak magnetic pulses while participants processed action words in a lexical decision task. When TMS was applied to the arm representation in the left hemisphere, that caused strong magnetic pulses to elicit muscle contractions in the right hand, faster processing of arm-related words occurred relative to leg-related words. Okay, so when you apply TMS or transcranial magnetic stimulation to the arm representation area of the left hemisphere, this causes muscle contractions in the right hand, right? Because remember the contralateral organization of the brain and its behaviors, okay? So when you apply that TMS to the left hemisphere area responsible for the arms, right? This will result in faster processing of arm-related words, but not leg-related words, okay? Cool, right? So we see that by stimulating, if we take TMS to the motor area of the brain, and we selectively stimulate specific sites, right? We can thereby elicit, here, we can elicit muscle contractions in the relevant site, which will then increase the processing speed of the relevant words, okay? So stimulate the hand area of the brain, right? The hand area of the motor cortex. This will elicit muscle contractions in the hand, right? And then that will increase the processing of hand words, okay? Similarly, if you apply TMS to the leg representation area in the left hemisphere, which causes strong elicitation, right? It causes muscle contractions in the right leg. This results in faster processing of leg-related words, but not arm-related words. Okay, so take your TMS, your transcranial magnetic stimulation, apply it to leg areas, right? This is gonna help recruit muscular activation in the leg, and that will help increase the processing of leg-related words, but not arm-related words. Okay, so this is very interesting, right? Here we're using a stimulation approach rather than just having you do a task and then I'm applying an imaging approach, right? So with fMRI, I want to get you to do a task first, and then I read a word, right? Read these leg words, and then I can see where in your brain, what parts of your brain are selectively active for that activity. Okay, so that's like getting you to do the behavior, and then I'm using imaging to see where in the brain we get selective activation for that behavior or that cognitive task. Okay, with TMS, I'm going to apply stimulation first, right? And then as the stimulation is applied, we'll see what behaviors that facilitates or hinders, right? And notice that we can go both ways to get converging evidence that, aha, these areas are definitely responsible for the processing of hand-related words, right? Because when I stimulate hand areas with TMS, this increases the speed of processing hand-related words. And when I apply TMS to the motor areas of the brain, this will increase the processing of leg-related words. Okay. Also, if I have you read arm-related words, we'll get activation in arm areas. And if I have you read leg-related words, we'll get activation in leg areas, right? And by applying different methods and systematically studying like hand areas, leg areas, we can become increasingly confident, right, that these areas of the brain, that these distributed functional networks are specialized for processing this type of information versus that type of information, right? Legs versus hands versus face, for example. Cool. So I think that this is a very nice study to end this part of the lecture with. Okay, so in sum, right, from the first article that we read by Pulvermuller, in previous work, comprehension of action-related language and concepts was found to be impaired after lesions to the motor system. So that was sort of one motivation for doing more work looking at functional links between the motor system and the speech system. Okay, you might ask, why is it the case that after a lesion to the motor area, you get impaired linguistic processing? That's really weird, right? That sort of set us on this trail to investigate functional links between motor areas and speech perception systems. ERP, event-related potential experiments that focused on the silent reading of face-related, arm-related, and leg-related words showed that category-specific differential activation was present 200 milliseconds after word onset. Okay. So we'll see that we're noticing these differences very early, right, between face-related, arm-related, and leg-related words. Results from MEG studies have shown that stronger activations were present in the left inferior frontal area for face-related and arm-related words than for leg-related words. Results from MEG studies have shown that stronger activations were present in the superior central area for leg-related words than for face-related and arm-related words. Pulvermuller 2005 suggests that during action word processing, the language regions and motor cortex are activated in parallel, following finely tuned spatiotemporal patterns. Pulvermuller 2005 suggests that in the same way that the mirror neuron theory implies that action understanding arises from an association between the perceived actions of others and one's own action control system, the comprehension of action-related language seems to require that words are mapped onto actions that one can perform oneself. All right, cool. Now that we've looked at the first article by Pulvermuller, which shows that processing hand-related, feet-related, and mouth-related words activates the corresponding areas in our premotor areas, right? That there's functional links between, we have functional links between movement, certain movements, and our understanding of certain concrete words. What I want to do in this next article that was published by Glenberg and colleagues in 2008 is to show, right, that the motor system is not only active in the processing of concrete words like punch, kick, and chew, but is also active in the processing of abstract language. Okay. This is sort of one of the challenges for embodied approaches to cognition, right? A lot of scholars nowadays will grant that, okay, for concrete words, the evidence is pretty compelling that areas of the brain that are involved in actions are also involved in processing concrete words, right? Given all the data from Pulvermuller and other colleagues, that the kind of results that we have just considered in the first half of the lecture, we see that there's some pretty compelling evidence that similar areas of the brain, certain neural circuits, are responsible for both actions as well as imaginations and comprehension, linguistic comprehension, okay? At least for concrete words, like punching is a concrete word, right? Kicking is a concrete word, and chewing, right? These are all things that you can see and that you can perform with your body. However, a question remains, and that is, okay, even if we grant that processing concrete language activates the motor system, we still have an important question, and that is, what's going on with abstract language? Is our processing of abstract language similarly engaging the motor system? Or maybe when we're doing philosophy or we're engaged in abstract thought, we're no longer recruiting the motor system, right? And some philosophers, especially those that challenge the embodied view, right, they are gonna want a more amodal or disembodied view of linguistic processing, right? So on the amodal view, right, the classical computational view of cognition, right, that thinks that cognition is sort of distinct from perception and action, right? This is also sometimes called the sandwich view of cognition, right? Like this is the old idea, right, from like the 50s, that cognition is sort of like the meat of the sandwich or the middle part of the sandwich, and everything that goes on cognitively is happening at a very abstract, higher level, right? And by abstract, we mean that it's happening at such a level that does not recruit any sensory motor qualities or sensory motor systems, right? You might think that when you're engaged in philosophical inquiry, for example, that this is purely abstract, right? And that the body is not a part of this, right? Think back about Descartes, right? His cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am, right? He is a thinking thing. And that is assumed to be, the idea is that it's assumed that you can be a thinking thing, but not necessarily an embodied thing, right? What is indubitable, what cannot be doubted, is sort of like the process of thinking, like in a language, like I think, therefore I am, right? Like notice the use of words in those constructions of Descartes, right? So that part is indubitable for him. What's dubitable, what can be doubted, is that he has a body, right? Like I might be dreaming that I have a body, or I might be in the matrix. And right, you can doubt the body, but for Descartes, you can't doubt that nature of thought. So you see that for many working on the philosophy of mind, or even just cognitive science, many still adopt or find strengths in the amodal approach. And a major sort of area of focus, right, for those that want to champion or support the classical view rather than the embodied view, would be emphasizing or looking at abstract things rather than concrete things. Okay, because it's going to be the abstract things that we never really have direct perceptual experience of, right? And so since we don't have direct perceptual experience of those abstract things, it may be that our cognition of the abstract does not similarly recruit the motor system. Okay, so I hope you can understand sort of what the debate is, right? Like, embodied theorists think that the motor system is involved in cognition, both concrete and abstract, whereas classical computational theory, or those that reject the embodied approach, they're going to think that abstract cognition does not necessarily require the motor system. Okay, so we see, tying this again back to our first lecture, Introduction to Cognitive Science, the importance of not just hanging out at one level of analysis. As a philosopher, you can speculate forever, right? Just sort of be comfortable in your own ideas and conceptual demarcations without ever checking any data to see if you make any sense, right? You can just say, well, based on what thoughts are, a thought must be this. And based on my definition of a thought, this is what falls out of my definition, right? And you might just, motivate an amodal theory of language in that way, right? But we see that what's great about cognitive science, and why cognitive science can make us better philosophers, right, is by becoming familiar and well situated in the literature regarding the cognitive neuroscience of language. We can offer more nuanced models and theories of how linguistic comprehension works, right? Notice that for everybody, even for philosophers, we're all pumping our intuitions with some sort of data, right? Even the philosopher that never took a neuroscience course is still drawing upon their own firsthand experience of language. And they're also drawing upon anecdotal evidence for how they think language works, right? Your philosopher of language that never took neuroscience still has an idea of how language works from their everyday use of language and what other philosophers have said about language, right? So their discussion of language is not from a non-empirical point, right? It's still, insofar as you do a philosophy of X, where X is something relatively empirical, it's impossible to do that well without some knowledge of that thing, right? Like, you can't do a philosophy of biology if you know no biology at all, right? Similarly, you can't really do excellent philosophy of language if you don't know anything about language, right? Right. So you see how by becoming at least familiarized with the important debates and some of the important findings from the literature, we can refine our models of language processing, right? Even if it's a philosophical theory of language processing, okay? And all my work in the philosophy of language is theoretical in that it applies to many data points, right? Like, my views of language apply to many data points and therefore help to explain lots of different things that we find in the data, right? So in that sense, it's a theoretical model. I'm not just talking about English or just about bad words, right? It's a grander theory, right, that applies to languages as such, but it's motivated and continuously refined, right, against the grain of empirical data, right? And that's why I think that my views have been very compelling and well cited in the literature, among the most cited in the literature. Also, why my view is not only cited by other theorists, but also many empirical scientists can use my work too, right? And that's the beauty about being an excellent philosopher, is that if your theories are crafted in accordance with, or with consultation with, or at least in awareness of empirical data, your theories can be useful to other theorists, as well as other particular scientists that are trying to figure out more particular empirical questions, okay? And even my work on slurs has been cited by the Supreme Court and in legal cases taken to the Supreme Court and other legal venues, right? And that just is to say that there's much to be gained in following Mars analysis and making sure that our theories, right, also get checked at the implementation level. And we use that implementation level to further fine-tune our theories at the computational or algorithmic levels, okay? And if you're unclear, if you forgot what, I mean by those distinctions, computational, algorithmic, and implementation levels, please refer back to the first lecture, Introduction to Cognitive Science. Okay, so what we're gonna do here is I wanna make a little bit more progress in our understanding of semantic processing by continuing our understanding of what's involved in the processing of concrete language, and using this article to show that the motor system is also involved in the processing of abstract language. Okay. So this article is appropriately titled Processing Abstract Language Modulates Motor System Activity. And this was published in the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology. I hope one thing that you've noticed in the course so far is that in cognitive science, we get to read a lot of cool articles in different types of journals. Right? We read philosophy articles, journals in experimental psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, and so on. All right, in this study, we're gonna have participants listen to different types of linguistic stimuli, okay? And I want us to, take a second to appreciate the stimuli here, okay? So that way you can think about perhaps constructing your own experiment with your own set of stimuli. And you can use the methods section of this article to help you generate, right, an appropriate replication and extension of your own, okay? You might, for example, prefer, right, if you are a native English speaker, or if you're a native Spanish speaker, perhaps you have access to a wide range of Spanish-speaking participants. Well, then what would be really cool is if you recreated a lot of the stimuli in Spanish, okay, or in another language. And then we can replicate and extend the study to show that we get similar results, not just for, French or English speakers, but also for Spanish, Italian, Japanese, Korean speakers as well. Okay. So in this table, we see that we have different sentence types and we have different sentence directions. Okay. So let's take a moment to appreciate this. This sentence, Marco gives you the papers, right? Think about what sentence direction that is, okay? Is that toward, away, or no transfer? All right, and so if you think about it, Marco gives you the papers, right? That's towards you, right? Marco gives you the papers, right? So if Marco gives you the papers, that sentence direction is towards you. Okay. If you give the papers to Marco, right? You give the papers to Marco, the implied sentence direction, right? If you're asking what direction is implied by this sentence, it's the direction implied is away, right? You give the papers to Marco. So the implied direction of the sentence is away from you. Okay. And then this sentence, you read the papers with Marco. So you read the paper with Marco. There's really like no transfer going on, right? It's like you two doing something together simultaneously. So there's no implied direction with that sentence. Okay. So we can see that in these three sentences, These are concrete sentences with an implied sentence direction toward, away, or with no implied direction of transfer. Okay. So this is very easy to understand in a concrete case. Now what we want to do is also understand that sentences can have an implied direction, even if they're abstract rather than concrete. Okay. So consider these sentences. Anna delegates the responsibilities to you. Okay, you can ask yourself, what's the implied sentence direction there, right? So Anna delegates the responsibilities to you, right? Well, if Anna delegated the responsibilities to you, then the implied sentence direction is still toward, right? Even though the sentence is abstract, or like delegating responsibilities is abstract. Like I don't hand you anything physical when I delegate responsibilities. Okay. And, we can also generate or think of other examples of abstract transfer, right? Like maybe love or adoration or justice are also sort of abstract things that may have an implied direction. Okay. So Anna delegates the responsibilities to you is abstract, but it represents or it implies direction towards you. The sentence, you delegate the responsibilities to Anna, right? You delegate the responsibilities to Anna. This is still an abstract sentence, right? You can't touch delegation or responsibilities, right? So we know that delegate responsibility is abstract, but this sentence nonetheless implies a direction of transfer. And this time it's a direction of transfer is going from you to Anna. So it's going away from you, right? So the implied sentence direction is away. And you discuss the responsibilities with Anna. This is, again, an abstract sentence, but there's no implied sentence direction with the sentence. Okay, so you see that what we've done here methodologically is we've taken sentence forms, right? Like you want to think of a transfer sentence. Like what's an example of a sentence that implies transfer in a direction that's away, right? And then you just come up with a concrete version, right? Something that you can touch, like Adam gave apples to Sarah, right? That would be like a concrete sentence because you can touch apples, right? Or I can say Adam honored or whatnot, right? Adam loved whatnot, right? And where love is like, you can't touch love. Like you can touch a kiss and a hug, but love, you can't really touch that. So love is abstract, right? So, I love my dog, right? There's a direction there, like I love my dog, but it's an abstract thing. Okay, so that's how you can go about generating, if you want to create your own experiment, how you can generate more instances of concrete towards, concrete away, or concrete sentences with no transfer implied, and how you can create abstract toward, abstract away, and abstract sentences with no implied direction. Okay, toward, away, and then no implied direction. Okay, and then in this experiment, they also use nonsense sentences. And two examples of nonsense sentences would be Giovanni sings the papers with you, and Danielle cleans the responsibilities to you. Okay, there's words there, but right, like you won't have a clear direction implied, and it's not clearly abstract or concrete because these are jumbled, right? There's words there, but they're jumbled in an unintelligible, nonsensical way. Okay, now that we have an idea of the stimuli that we're going to work with in this study, okay, we're going to feed the stimuli to participants, right? And see what sort of activation well, what kind of behavior we get, as well as what sort of neural responses we get, right? We're going to have two studies here, experiment 1 and experiment 2. Experiment 1 is going to draw more on behavioral measures, and experiment 2 is going to draw more on neural measures. Okay, so experiment 1 used a behavioral measure to test for an action sentence compatibility effect in participants. The action sentence compatibility effect was demonstrated in an earlier paper, Grounding Language in Action by Glenberg. So check that out. It's also a great paper. However, I'll just summarize for you what the action sentence compatibility effect is for this paper. The action sentence compatibility effect, or ACE, refers to the fact that responses are faster when the action described in a sentence is congruent with the action a subject had to perform to respond to the sentence than when the action is incongruent. Okay, so imagine this. Imagine you have like, let me grab this thing. So imagine this is like a joystick, okay? And I'm gonna use this joystick to respond in an experimental case. Okay, so I'm a participant and I'm engaged in this study, and what I may be instructed is when you hear sentences with an implied direction towards you, move the joystick in a congruent direction, right? So since the implied sentence direction is towards me, right? Like Sarah gave you an apple, right? And if my response is that that is a sensible sentence, I might be instructed to pull the joystick towards me. And notice that I should be rather quick to do that, right? Because since the sentence has implied direction towards me, I'm going to be sort of recruiting areas of my brain, processing that, and engaging in the motor action in the same direction should be facilitated. Whereas if I had to respond with an incongruent action, it would take longer, right? So let me say that again, just to be super clear. For a sentence of the form, Sarah gave you an apple, and I have to respond that that's intelligible, that's sensible, right? This is the congruent direction. I'm gonna be faster to respond this way, right? Sarah gave you an apple, is that sensible or not? Sensible, right? Yes. Notice that I would be slower if in processing the sentence, Sarah gave you an apple, is that sentence intelligible if I had to move the other way, the incongruent direction, right? So you're processing, Sarah gave you the apple, is that sensible? Yes. Incongruent action. It's going to take you longer to do that incongruent action than the congruent one, okay? And that's what's meant by the action sentence compatibility effect, is that the sentence, Sarah gave you the apple, and the relevant action moving in the same direction, right? When those are compatible, you're going to get a faster response than when it's incompatible. Okay, so similarly, if the implied sentence direction was away, right? Like you gave Joanna an apple. Okay, so cool. I gave Joanna an apple. Well, the implied direction is toward, or it's that way, right? Away from me, right? So this can be. All right, so I just want to make clear that toward, right, means toward you, and away means away from you, right? So when I have the sentence, I gave Joanna the apple, the implied sentence direction is away, right? Away. So participants will be quicker to respond when their action is congruent with the implied sentence direction. Okay, so take a moment just to get comfortable with this action sentence compatibility effect before moving on. Okay, so ask yourself for a few practice sentences, right? A toward sentence, a toward you sentence, right? Think of a toward you sentence. This time we'll think of an abstract one. like my dog loves me, right? The implied direction is toward me, right? And so will I be faster responding like this or like that, right? And if the action is implied, if the direction is implied towards me by that sentence, then I will be faster, right, to reply in a congruent manner, right, toward me, okay? If I have an abstract sentence like I love my dog, right? So this time the implied direction is away from me, right? Excuse me, away from me, right, towards somebody else, toward my dog and away from me, then we know that the compatible action is going to be in that direction. Okay, action sentence compatibility effect. All right, so I hope that that was clear for you. In experiment 1, when the described direction of object transfer matched the literal direction of a hand movement used to make a response, the speed of responding was faster compared to when the two directions mismatched. In experiment 1, when the described direction of information transfer matched the literal direction of a hand movement used to make a response, the speed of responding was faster compared to when the two directions mismatched. Okay, and so let's go ahead and just take a look at this figure here on the right. Okay, so we see that these are cases of no transfer right here, right? And no transfer is indicated by the circles, okay? Transfer away is represented here. Okay, so we see this is like sort of like an asterisk or a star looking symbol here. We see that away is represented by this right here. And what do we see? That away, so when my response direction is this way, right? The response time is faster for the yes is far condition, right? Where the sentence, yes, the sentence is sensible when I have to push the joystick away from me, right? Like towards the other direction, okay? I'll try not to confuse you and just stick with the same terminology, away, okay? So away from me, we're using us as the reference point for toward or away, okay? So notice that that shows the action sentence compatibility effect here, right? The speed of response, right? We see here, that's the judgment time here on the y-axis, right? Where lower on the y-axis means that the judgment or response time was quicker. And when we go higher on the y-axis, this is showing that the judgment or response time was slower, okay? On the x-axis, we have first the yes is near condition, or the response location, right? So to say yes, a given sentence is sensible, right? This is the yes is near. To say yes, a given sentence is sensible, this is the yes is far condition, right? The yes is near means to say yes, a given sentence is sensible, I have to go nearer to me, okay? And the yes is far, right? That is the situation in which I have to respond that yes, this sentence is sensible by indicating a motion away from me. Okay, so right, notice how cool this study is. Like we just feed participants these different sentence forms, right? Concrete and abstract sentences that either imply direction towards, away, or no transfer, right? And we also feed them nonsense sentences too, and we see how they are able to react, right? How they're able to judge those sentences as sensible or not, right? With their response directions, okay? So in this away, for away sentences, okay, of concrete and abstract varieties, so sentence of this form, just to be super clear, you give the papers to Marco, you give the papers to Marco, right? So this is away, right? And then we see here that you answer that quicker when the response is read the sentence. You give the papers to Marco. Is that sensible or not? Yes, it's sensible, right? When my response direction is in a congruent direction as the implied sentence direction, we see that the judgment time is much quicker, okay? And we see that when the response direction is incongruent, right? It mismatches the implied sentence direction, it takes us longer, right? So for away sentences, you give the papers to Marco, right? The implied sentence direction is you give the papers to Marco is that way. If I have to say, yes, that's intelligible or sensible by going in the opposite direction, right? Notice that my response in this case is opposite because I'm saying yes rather than yes, right? Notice that it takes me longer here, okay? When the sentence implies direction that way, but my response is this way, incongruent, we see that it takes longer to do that. Action sentence compatibility effect, okay? For away sentences, to summarize this to make it very clear, for away sentences, I'm quicker to respond that yes, that's a sensible sentence when I respond by pressing the joystick away from me than if I have to respond by pressing the joystick close to me, okay? Hope that makes good sense to you, okay? It would sort of be like if I told you jump, but then you had to do the opposite of jumping, right? Rather than doing an action that's congruent with it, right? You have to like take a moment to like reorganize your thought and then do the opposite thing. And that is gonna have a cost associated with it, okay? So it's sort of a similar idea here with action sentence compatibility effect. The sentence is gonna prime you for action in one direction, and by having to respond in the same direction, you'll be quick. But if you have to then respond in the opposite direction, it's gonna take you a moment to like reorient yourself and then respond appropriately. And this increased time is reflecting that sort of like readjustment or whatnot, okay? Cool. Now that we got clear on the away sentence, let's look at the toward sentence, okay? Toward sentences are represented by the box. And just so we're clear on what the toward sentences sound like, right? The examples is Marco gives you the papers, okay? So towards you, right? The implied sentence direction is towards you. Marco gives you the papers. So if I say, hey, Marco gives you the papers, is that sensible or not, right? Press, we'll see here that if I say Marco gives you the papers, is that sensible or not? If you're in the yes is near, you'll have to say yes, right? If you're in the yes is far, you'll have to say yes, right? But the direction in which you push the joystick will be different, okay? And in this case, for Marco gives you the papers, which has an implied sentence direction towards you, notice that the congruent direction for your response will also be towards you, okay? So Marco gives you the papers, is that sensible or not? Yes, right? This is going to be a little bit quicker than Marco gives you the papers, is that sensible or not? Yes, right? It'll just take a little bit longer to respond in the incongruent direction rather than the congruent direction. And that is evidenced here in the figure. Okay, we see that for toward sentences, sentences with an implied direction towards you, we're a little bit quicker at responding right? For the yes is near rather than the yes is far. Okay, so for the sentence, Marco gives you the paper, is that intelligible? I'm a little bit quicker when I say yes and bring the joystick towards me to indicate that answer. Then I have to say to the sentence, Marco gives you the papers, Marco gives you the papers. If I have to respond by pressing that way, yes, that takes a little bit longer, right? Because my direction of action conflicts with the implied sentence direction in that case, right? In the yes is far case, when the sentence is, Marco gives you the papers, okay? And importantly, notice that these are going in opposite directions, right? So we get something that looks a little bit like this, okay? And that shows you that we get the results sort of in both ways, right? We get the action sentence compatibility effect, right, for toward sentences, and then also we get the action sentence compatibility effect for away sentences. Okay, and this is a pretty nice demonstration of the results here. Okay, all right, cool. And this also just shows that the processing for sentences with no transfer just takes longer than those with transfer. Okay, and that's why these circular dots are significantly higher on the y-axis. All right, so I really wanted you to get clear on that. Some of my students in previous semesters were just, struggling to understand the action sentence compatibility effect. Okay, so I hope that spending a lot of time on that in the lecture today helps you to get very clear on what's going on with that. Okay. Okay, next. And the important thing, one more thing I want to point out in this right here is that this data, the results are for both concrete and abstract sentences, okay, which is really cool, right? We get an action sentence compatibility effect even for sentences that described abstract information transfer, right? And not just concrete transfer of items, okay? And that's super important for, especially for the second paper, we're focusing on abstract language. And that's sort of the cool thing here is that we see there's an action sentence compatibility effect, even for sentences involving abstract information. For example, Anna delegates the responsibilities to you. We can add action sentence compatibility effect with that, right? So for that sentence, is it sensible? I'm faster responding in the same direction, okay? For you delegate the responsibilities to Anna. For that abstract sentence, yes, that's sensible. I'm quicker to respond in a congruent direction, okay? And that's really amazing, right? Because for those of us that are interested in embodied approaches to cognition, it offers some compelling information or data that, we might be onto something here, that because we get an action sentence compatibility effect, not just for concrete transfer, but also for abstract transfer, there's something going on, right? Cognitively, that's similar between the concrete and the abstract case, okay? Maybe the abstract case is strongly parasitic on the concrete case, right? And therefore, processing abstract language may be parasitic on processing concrete language. And therefore, we might have one coherent story to tell about the processing of language, abstract and concrete as such, right? Also, this provides a gnarly challenge for classical approaches to cognition, right? If you deny embodied approaches, right? If you reject the view that the body is involved in processing linguistic information, then you need to come up with an explanation for what's going on here with the action sentence compatibility effect, particularly for the processing of abstract language. Like, why do we get these results here, right? For these sentences in particular, right? For these sentences, okay, we get it. It's concrete objects, right? What about these? All right, this is the sticking point for those that reject embodied approaches or the embodiment thesis, okay? So, and again, this is not to say, if you're a philosopher of language that adopts a more traditional approach, this is a refutation towards your view. Absolutely not, right? I'm not trying to refute anyone or dissuade anyone, rather the opposite. I'm trying to encourage you to fine-tune your theory. And if you can be a traditionalist that can account for this finding, right, then you need to write a paper on that, right? That would be very valuable for the field, right? Especially it would help motivate new research for theorists of this type. Okay, so everything that I'm sharing is one, either to extend the work of people that are already interested in this type of work, but also two, this may serve as points of opportunities, right? Opportunities to consider challenges that you can overcome. Okay, maybe you have a theory for how abstract language processing can account for this data without recruiting the motor system. Okay. And if you do, then you can write sort of a response paper to one of these papers. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Now that we looked at some behavioral data, like the action sentence compatibility effect, excuse me, we're going to look at the next study on TMS. Hold on one second, I'm going to get a drink of water. Okay, so in experiment 2, we're going to use TMS to see if we can get some data that'll support our behavioral data, right? It would be very cool if we can get TMS data that supports our behavioral data. So experiment 2 uses single pulse TMS to study changes in the cortical spinal motor pathways to hand muscles while reading the same sentences. Okay, so the sentences that are involved in experiment 2, the same as from experiment 1. In experiment 2, what do we see? All right, so what we're looking for is to see if by applying TMS, we get any change in activation, okay, to the cortical spinal motor pathways. And in experiment 2, we see that there is greater modulation of activity in the hand muscles when individuals read sentences that describe the transfer of concrete objects and abstract information, compared to when individuals read sentences that do not describe any kind of transfer. So this is another gnarly result, right? So let's go ahead and look at the figure and then I'll just talk about it. Okay. So here we have pulse time on the x-axis, and we have the z-score for stimulation on the y-axis. Okay. So you can sort of think of the y-axis as how much modulation of activity in the hand muscles we see from our participants. Okay. And what do we see here, right? We see that the circles represent sentences for no transfer, right? So recall sample sentences that do not imply any transfer. This would be sentences of this form. You read the papers with Marco, right? You read the papers with Marco. There's no transfer, okay? Also, you discussed the responsibilities with Anna, right? This is no transfer, okay? So when we read sentences without any transfer, we see that there is less modulation of activity in the hand muscles, okay? And we see that here, this is lower than this, okay? On the other hand, when we read sentences that involve transfer, so sentence of the form, Marco gave you the papers, or Anna delegates the responsibilities to you, right? Those are concrete and abstract sentences with an implied sentence direction towards you, okay? The sentences you gave the papers to Marco and you delegated the responsibilities to Anna, those are concrete and abstract sentences with implied sentence direction away from you, okay? And notice that both these sentences describe some sort of transfer, either concretely or abstractly. But regardless, right, for all transfers, we see that there is greater modulation of activity in hand muscles for transfer sentences only, but not for those that do not involve transfer. Okay, so this is really amazing, right? And that we get greater activation for, we get a greater modulation of activity in the hand muscles only for sentences describing transfer, but not for those that do not describe transfer. Right? And so again, this is amazing. Why would we get greater modulation in the hand muscles when we read sentences with an implied direction of transfer, right? Whether abstract or concrete, but not for sentences that do not imply transfer, right? And it suggests that the motor system, right, the hand muscles, is in some sense recruited or involved in the reading of these sentences, the transfer sentences, but not non-transfer sentences. Okay, cool. And then here we just see that if you're wondering, like, why do we get a fall off here in both the transfer and non-transfer sentences? And that's just to say that by the time we read the verb, right? So a verb may be gives you more, right? Marco gives you, right? That's a verb, right? Anna delegates, right? It's a verb, right? So that's what we mean by here, is that we're going to get the greatest modulation of activity in the hand muscles at the verb, right? So gives, like Adam gave you an A. That's sort of like, or Adam gave you, Adam loves his dog, right? So when Adam loves his dog, right, you're going to get the greatest modulation of activity in the hand muscles when you read that word, the verb, gave or loves, right? And then, so we'll see here, right? So Adam loves Loki, right? That's my dog. We'll see that when you read the verb loves, we get the greatest modulation of the hand muscles there. And then by the time we get to the end of the sentence, like Adam loves Loki, right? By the time we get to the end of Loki, the modulation of activity in the hand muscles decreases, but it's still greater than the activity we get in the hand muscles from non-transfer sentences, okay? And then over here, this would just show you that when we read the verb for non-transfer, you discuss the responsibilities with Anna, for example. When we read that sentence, when we get to the word discuss, we're going to get the most modulation of activity in the hand muscles, okay? And then when we get to the end of that sentence, right, past the verb, when we get to the end of the sentence, we get decreased modulation of activity in the hand muscles. So that's showing you that even like within sentence, right, like intra-sentence analysis, we can see that we get peak modulation of activity in the hand muscles at the verb, right? That's pretty cool, right? Adam, punched the punching bag, right? But also Adam loves Loki. And that's cool that at the verb, we get increased modulation of activity in the hands, even for verbs like love, right? And not only does the verb, like in an intra-sentence sort of analysis, but when we look at the whole sentence, right? So what I was trying to say in the previous point is that when we're looking just within sentences, we see the most modulation of hand activity at the verb, right? For both transfer and non-transfer sentences. And that's what this is showing here, okay? The next point I'm trying to make is that for transfer sentences, at the verb and even at the end of the sentence, like across the whole sentence, right? We get greater modulation of activity in the hand muscles for this whole sentence compared to this whole sentence, okay? At the verb and also throughout the sentence, throughout the rest of the sentence, all the way to the end of the sentence, okay? Which is really cool, which is showing you that we're getting greater modulation of activity in the hand muscles for transfer sentences as opposed to non-transfer sentences, Okay, and again, the important thing for the second paper is that this finding applies to abstract transfer and not just concrete transfer. Excuse me. Okay, so when we're processing abstract language, we still get activation, right? We get selective modulation of activity in the hand muscles. Even when we process abstract language involving transfer, as opposed to language not involving transfer. Okay, and the question is, especially for those that adopt a more classical approach and reject the embodied approach to cognition, like how do we account for this finding if you think that the body is not involved in language comprehension? Okay. On the other hand, if you're an embodied theorist or you adopt an embodied approach to cognition, this is sort of another interesting finding that you can integrate into your theoretical framework. Okay. Whereas the first article by Pulvermuller focused mostly on concrete concepts, right? We see that with this article, we can now extend our view of language comprehension a little bit more, right, to include abstract language as well. Okay, it looks like how we process abstract language is in some sense derived from or parasitic on how we process concrete language. Okay, or at least that's sort of the thought that I want you to, spend some time with on this lecture. All right, so Glenberg 2008 provided neurophysiological evidence for the modulation of motor system activity during the comprehension of both concrete language and abstract language. How cool is that? This finding about abstract language is particularly interesting since many scholars have thought that abstract language may not be grounded in motor system activity in the way that concrete language may be grounded. Previously, it was thought that concrete language about apples and dogs may be more reasonably grounded in motor system activity than abstract language about justice and love. But this study shows that even processing of abstract language is intimately connected to motor system activity. Interestingly enough, the notion that the same action schema is used for understanding both concrete and abstract transfer is consistent with previous analyses of sign languages, such as American Sign Language. Okay, and this shouldn't be so surprising for us linguists and cognitive scientists of language, because we know now at this point that sign language is a bona fide and full-fledged language, just like spoken languages are. Remember that embodiment theory proposes that neural systems for perception and action are also engaged during language comprehension. In accord with the embodiment theory, Glenberg and colleagues suggest that the mirror neuron system plays an important role in understanding observed actions and language about actions. All right, so that was the main point for this lecture by Glenberg and colleagues 2008, as well as the point about Pulvermuller, the article by Pulvermuller. I believe it was, what was it, 2005. Okay, and so today we covered quite a bit. Importantly, we covered the cognitive neuroscience of semantic processing in the lecture today. We found that the motor system is going to be involved, or at least partially implicated, in the processing of both concrete language and abstract language. And we saw that with the article by Glenberg and colleagues. We also saw that linguistic processing regarding certain types of content, like semantic categories, activates certain neural circuits, right, in specific ways, right? So we saw, for example, in the Pulvermuller article, that processing foot-related words activates areas of the brain that are similar to those that are involved in kicking and in imagining, right, or mentally simulating kicking behavior. Okay. We also saw that processing hand-related words activated relevant areas involved in punching or imagining punching. Okay. And then finally, we saw that the linguistic processing of mouth-related words also activated areas of the brain that are related to chewing and imagining chewing behaviors. Okay. In short, similar neural circuits are involved in language comprehension, action, and mental simulation or imagination. Okay. And we see that's the case for both hand, foot, and arm related words. Okay. So I hope that you enjoyed this lecture as much as I did. I think that this is really awesome content. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture and that you learned a lot about both the cognitive neuroscience of semantic processing, but also you learned about the somatotopic representation of the body and the brain, right? Both in the motor area and sensory areas, okay? And I also hope that you found this lecture a great opportunity to become familiarized with the action sentence compatibility effect, which is a very important effect that we use in the behavioral sciences or in the psychological sciences. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit today. Please take a moment to appreciate these beautiful figures. And I just want to say thank you for your attention today. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our next lecture.